Hey everyone, Mr. Lane here. Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis, which we're actually going to use, and we're going to continue our conversation about cellular respiration to talk about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the process by which we are capturing sunlight and making sugars. So here we're going to start off with this diagram. And this is a diagram that we've seen now 7 times, I believe. And again, remember, we have sunlight coming in, captured by the chloroplast. The chloroplast is using that energy to put CO2 together to make sugars. Those sugars are broken apart in the mitochondria and for the production of ATP. Ultimately, all the energy that was originally captured as sunlight is lost as heat, and the matter cycles through again. So again, matter cycles, energy flows. Don't forget that. That's a big theme. Last time we talked, we started down here with ATP, and we said ATP, how do we make that? And we said, well, ATP is made by cellular respiration. So we said originally that ATP is made by cellular respiration, but now we got in a little bit more depth. We said that ATP, there was this wicked cool protein called ATP synthase that was spinning around like a little whirligig beetle and just cranking off ATPs, putting phosphates on ADP. And then we said, well, what drives that pump? And then we said, well, there was protons. Protons passed across the membrane. And how do those protons get into a high concentration? Well, through active transport. Well, where did the energy for active transport came from? Well, it came from NADH and FADH2 and the high energy electrons that they carried. Well, and then we're like, well, where do those high energy electrons came from? And we're like, well, they're from glycolysis. They are fed by pyruvate. So pyruvate and then acetyl-CoA, there's these carbohydrates that are fueling this and they're breaking down and they're forming CO2. We said, well, okay, cool, glucose. Where does that come from then? And that's the question we're going to answer now. So where does the glucose come from? Glucose is what is driving all of cellular respiration to make a metric butt ton of ATP. Where does that glucose come from? If this is what is powering every living thing on planet Earth, including us, where does it come from? How do we make glucose? Well, to answer that question, we have to know something about the anatomy of a chloroplast. So here, just like we had to know the anatomy of a mitochondria, this is the anatomy of a chloroplast. Now, it looks fairly similar, although there are some differences. You have the outer membrane, you have the inner membrane. Inside that inner membrane, you have these stacks of thylakoids, okay? So a stack of thylakoids is called a granum. I always think of it as like a granum of pancakes, right? Where the thylakoid would be each individual cake and the stack would be the granum. So next time you have a delicious breakfast treat, you can ask your person serving if you could have a granum of pancakes and see if they're biologists or not. Now, the space between the inner membrane and the thylakoid membrane is something called the stroma. So the stroma, think of it as kind of the intermembrane space of the chloroplast. All right, so this is the diagram that you will have to know and I will be referring back to again. And just like cellular respiration, you will have to know where each reactant and where each product is used or produced and how it is used or produced. Again, we have a paired reaction here. We have sunlight going in, providing the energy that is driving this now anabolic reaction. This is an anabolic reaction because we are building things up. So you'll have to know where each one of those are and what they mean. All right, so keep that in the back of your head. Keep this diagram in the back of your head, and here we go. So this is the map. Again, I don't want to start someplace where you're lost. If a map is totally useless if you're completely lost. So I want to start off with where we know what we know. We know that sugar is what we're starting with. We're starting with glucose, okay? Here's that glucose molecule. That's where we're starting. This is where we ended with cellular respiration. We ended with this getting broken up into 2-3 carbon sugars. Now we're going to start with this all the way at the end of photosynthesis, okay? We're going to work our way back, and what we're going to see is there's something called the Calvin cycle, all right? And we see CO2 is coming into the Calvin cycle and glucose is coming out. And we see, well, there's ATP and there's something now NADPH. We have these players here. So this ATP we know, NADPH looks familiar. And we have them coming from something called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1, where water is turning into oxygen, which should also look familiar. So I want you to draw connections between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. We have very similar things happening just in a little bit different order. And then finally we have sunlight coming in. So this is where we're going to go. We're going to check out each one of these steps, just 2 in photosynthesis, and we will be done. So the Calvin cycle. We're starting down here with glucose. We see that glucose is the output. Okay, the Calvin cycle is happening in the stroma, okay, in the stroma of the chloroplast. And what this means is that we have to have energy input, right? If we are making glucose, we need to be putting energy into snapping these bonds together. Okay, so what we have as the matter input is carbon dioxide. We have 3 carbon dioxide up here coming in, and then we have it go around once. But wait a minute, if we have only 3 carbon dioxides, but I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons in my glucose, how many times must this go around if I have 3 carbons going in and 6 carbons coming out? That's your first question. Okay, obviously the answer to the question is 2. It has to go around the carbon cycle twice because 3 times 2 is 6. So when it goes around the Calvin cycle twice, then we have one output of a glucose molecule. Now, if we are putting bonds together, we know that takes energy, just like from ADP to ATP. So if we're putting carbon atoms together, we need energy. Where is that energy coming from? If we look at the Calvin cycle here, we can see that there are some coupled reactions. We have ATP driving this reaction right here, and we have NADPH, but we have 6 NADPH, and again, 6 ATP driving this reaction here. We have another 3 ATP invested over here, okay? So ATP and NADPH are supplying the energy. They are coupled reactions to put carbon dioxides together to make a glucose molecule. And again, you do not need to know all the intermediate steps here. All I would like you to know is that carbon dioxide goes in, it goes around the cycle twice, glucose comes out, the energy needed is supplied from ATP and NADPH. Do not confuse that with NADH from cellular respiration. The way I remember this is NADPH. The P is for photosynthesis. That's just one easy way to remember it. Okay, so what's the next question then? The question is, well, where the heck are we getting this ATP and NADPH? Well, that's where we're going to go next. So, a quick recap on the Calvin cycle before we move on. Calvin cycle is sometimes called the dark reactions. Why might it be called the dark reactions? Well, it's because it doesn't require sunlight. So the sunlight, this is a reaction that plants can do after the sun has gone down, that they can continue to make sugar provided that they have enough ATP and NADPH stored up. In fact, that's what things like cactuses do. They suck in all their CO2 only at night, and they spend all day just stockpiling NADPH and ATP so that at night they can suck in the CO2 and actually make sugars at night. The carbon dioxide is absorbed from the atmosphere. Again, trees and plants are made out of air. They get their carbon from the atmosphere. So when you look at a tree, when you look at a plant, every carbon atom in that plant came from the atmosphere, which blows your mind, should blow your mind. When you look at a tree, you are looking at a whole bunch of carbon that was previously in the air. Energy from ATP and NADPH is used to create those chemical bonds. And finally, glucose and other complex carbohydrates are produced. So where do we get that ATP? Well, thinking back to cellular respiration, we had this wicked cool enzyme ATP synthase that was spinning around, and we had ADP turning into ATP. That spinning was occurring because we had a proton, high concentration gradient of protons that was flowing from the intermembrane space into the matrix, okay, and that was causing this to spin. And the energy source here was NADH and FADH2. So we had active transport pumping protons into a high energy or high concentration, flowing back through diffusion, through ATP synthase, causing it to spin. All right? Now let's take a look, see what's happening in photosynthesis. Here's the light reaction in photosynthesis. This should look like, oh, I think I can make sense of that. I think I can do this. What we have is we have some proton pumping. Okay? We have protons pumping into the thylakoid space. Those protons are flowing through ATP synthase, same ATP synthase that you guys know and love, and that's causing it to spin to make ATP. Okay? So we have some active transport. Now, if we have active transport pumping protons into the thylakoid space, where is the energy coming from for those protons? Well, it's coming from sunlight. So plants are using sunlight to pump protons across the thylakoid membrane into the thylakoid space to run ATP synthase to make glucose in the Calvin cycle. So they're using the same process that you and I are using to make ATP. The only difference is they're using sunlight as their energy source, not sugar. Okay, so let's take a closer look here. And what we see is that water is being split. So we're actually splitting water to make those protons here in the thylakoid space in something called photosystem 2. And we're also producing the oxygen here. Okay, so oxygen is being produced as a waste product. In fact, the plants can't wait to get rid of it. It's just like when we exhale, plants want to get rid of that oxygen. Okay, we're going to take a closer look now at photosystems 2 and 1. Oh, here's another example of the exact same thing. Should look very similar to cellular respiration. You have energy from the sun coming in here. Here's photosystem 2. Here's photosystem 1. You have water being split into hydrogen ions or protons and oxygen gas as a waste. Those protons are flowing through ATP synthase, which is spinning, 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 making a whole grip of ATP. And some of that, and this is the part we're going to come back and talk to, those electrons that came from water are stored in NADPH. So, settle down. This might look confusing. I'm going to talk through this one, and then I'm going to show you the third grade version, and it should make sense. Okay, so we have photosystem 2. And you might be asking, like, why are we starting with photosystem 2? Well, it's because we discovered photosystem 1 first, and then we discovered photosystem 2. So the name's kind of stuck. So light comes in at photosystem 2. Each one of these green circles represents a chlorophyll molecule. Chlorophyll molecules actually look like little radar dishes. And what they do is when sunlight hits them, the sunlight comes in and it bounces back and forth. And when it bounces back and forth, it excites an electron. That electron gets kind of tossed back and forth. Think of it as almost like a game of hot potato. So this electron gets excited on this chlorophyll, throws it to another chlorophyll, gets some more energy, and you can see that getting bounced back and forth between these molecules until it reaches this primary acceptor. When it reaches a primary acceptor, it gets tossed off. Okay, so as this electron is bouncing around, it's getting more and more energy. The electrons, again, they're coming from hydrogen in the water. The hydrogen ion, the proton, is being passed off into the thylakoid space, and the oxygen is being released as waste. Those electrons are coming from those hydrogens, so there they are. Okay, as that electron gets passed off, it loses energy. Remember, it's stepwise energy transfer, so it's getting bounced down some steps. As it's getting passed down those steps, it's ultimately running ATP. So this is getting pumped into that thylakoid space, running ATP synthase. Then that electron goes to photosystem 1, where another photon of light comes in, gives it a whole grip more of energy, and it gets passed off. See, now those electrons are getting passed off to NADPH, which is a high energy electron truck. Just like NADH and FADH2 from respiration, NADPH is just a truck that's carrying high energy electrons. Okay? All right. If this didn't make sense, if you're feeling kind of nervous, here's the second grade explanation. There's a guy with a big hammer. It's a photon hammer. And he hits an electron up to the top of this tower, which is photosystem 2. Then the nice lady rolls that high energy electron down a little ramp, which causes this little mill to spin, which makes a whole bunch of ATP. It's now that electron's at a little bit lower power, so another guy with a big bad photon hammer comes and smashes the electron and gives it to a really big high energy electron guy at the top. He then puts it in a bucket that we call NADPH. The ATP and the NADPH then go off to the Calvin cycle to make glucose. So I hope that makes more sense than this one. If this doesn't make sense, then we should chat. But thinking about this simplified understanding, go back now and look at this and see if you can make sense of it. Again, you don't need to know all the different proteins in there. You should know the basic structure, the basic process of what's going on. So why are plants green? This is like the ultimate question. Why are plants green? I don't know. Well, their plants are green because they are reflecting green light. All right. If they are reflecting green light, that means they are absorbing all the other ones. If you recall from previous science classes, we have Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet are the spectrum of visible light. Plants are incredibly efficient at absorbing all of these other colors and reflecting green. Why, you might ask, though? That's the question. This really tells us something about our sun, that of all of the visible spectrum, which wavelength is our sun producing the least of? And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. That because our sun is actually producing the least amount of green light compared to the others, there's not a selective advantage to absorb green light. In fact, we could have plants of other colors, but they would be outcompeted by the green plants. This is another really cool thing to think about, that if you went to another planet on a different star, if that star was made out of a little bit different chemicals and elements, it would be giving off a different spectrum of light. We would predict that the plants, if they were on a planet orbiting that sun or that star, would be of a different color. And they'd be of the color that is least emitted by that star. So yeah, that's pretty neat. So here's an example of the wavelength of light that you will have to be able to interpret for the test. Here we go at 400 nanometers, and here we go up at 700 nanometers. So you have your V, your violet down here, and your far reds over here. And we see that we have multiple different pigments here. We have chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, two different types of pigments, just two different types of those radar dishes. And then we have these things called carotenoids. All right, and if you look, they all reflect light where they have the lowest absorbance. So this is absorption spectrum. They have the lowest absorbance in this green range, and that's why plants are green, okay? Where they have the highest absorbance over here in the reds, and they have the highest absorbance over here in the blues and the purples. All right, so chlorophyll A, it's the main photosynthetic pigment. There are also accessory pigments such as chlorophyll B that pretty much just make that spectrum wider for photosynthesis to occur. I'm going to refer back to the graph. If you look, if we had just chlorophyll A, this is the only place we could absorb light. But with chlorophyll B, now we have expanded our absorption spectrum. So we now have, we can get more light from different wavelengths. There are also these accessory pigments called carotenoids and xanthophylls. They are absorbing extra light that would damage the chlorophyll. Think of them as weird as this is going to sound, almost a sunscreen. They're a sunscreen for chlorophyll A and B. Chlorophyll A and B are exceedingly delicate. And if the sun is too strong, it can actually damage those molecules. So we have carotenoids and xanthophylls that absorb that excess sunlight. Now let's go back and take a look here. If we look at the carotenoids, they absorb in this blue, very bottom of the green, blue to purple spectrum. They don't absorb anything in the yellow, orange, or red. So my question then is, why do leaves change color in the fall? And to answer that question, we have to think about the carotenoids and xanthophylls. So these carotenoids and xanthophylls, they're in there all year round, protecting chlorophyll A and B. When fall comes around, the plant starts degrading its chlorophyll A and B. It starts breaking them down because it doesn't want to get them damaged by the cold, because it knows winter is coming. And what happens when we take away chlorophyll A and B is the absorption for this end of the spectrum goes away. That means we are now reflecting this light, that these carotenoids and xanthophylls, they're still absorbing over on this end of the spectrum, but we are now reflecting this end of the spectrum. And if you think about it, what color are trees in the fall? They're yellow, orange, and red. And they're yellow, orange, and red because chlorophyll has been degraded. So when you think about this, these colors are always there. Even when the plant is green, we just can't see them because there's more chlorophyll. So really, when fall comes around, the trees are revealing kind of their true colors underneath all that chlorophyll, which is kind of interesting. And on that note, it's time for your moment of monkey.